Hello, and welcome to Module 2 or Week 2. Hopefully you guys got the hang of it with the first module, and we're just going to continue doing things like this for probably the foreseeable future. This is how I handled classes last semester, and it seemed to go well. And unless something changes or this doesn't seem to be working out very well, we're probably just going to keep doing the class as these online modules. So this week we're talking about, we're sort of expanding, we sort of introduced the idea of biogeography and what it is as a science last week. This week we're going to get into some of the sort of foundational patterns that we see if biogeography is, ultimately about explaining the type of biodiversity patterns we see, then what are some of those foundational things that create those patterns? And so we kind of refer to this as the geographic template. So let's kind of get into it. So one of the broadest patterns, if you take a zoomed out view as possible of Earth, one thing that becomes clear is that pretty much everywhere, I mean almost everywhere on Earth, there's some kind of organism there. There's some kind of life, but not all organisms are everywhere. And so it's sort of that dichotomy that we're looking at. So there's all sorts of life, and almost anywhere you look, you're going to find some type of it, but it's not always the same type in every single place. So what are those specific types of adaptations that allow certain types of organisms or species to exist in some locations and not in other locations? That's a fundamental question of biogeography. And it sort of leads to, if you're talking about where an organism is located, if you want to look at that spatial distribution, that's something we refer to as the geographic range. Basically, where is a species found on the planet? Where is that spatially? That's going to be the geographic range. And it's kind of the fundamental unit of biogeography. It's sort of, you got to kind of, it's sort of the first thing you have to figure out if you want to start asking more complex questions. The first thing you have to know is, where is the species that I'm interested? Where is it found? And then you can start getting into questions like, why is it there? And why isn't it somewhere else? And why is that, if we're talking about this, why is the Canada lynx range up here and the bobcat range down here? And what's going on? Why is there overlap here but not anywhere else? Those are types of biogeographical questions that you can start to get into. And when we're looking at this, it's sort of a like why certain species are where they are. It's a combination of things. So one, it's adaptations to the abiotic environment. Things like, what's how much rainfall do you get? What's the average temperature? What's the minimum and maximum temperatures? And what's the elevation and the surrounding environment, like things like that. But there's also biotic interactions that come into play as well. So, is it compete? What's the competition like within that species? And is it a predator species or is it a prey species? Is it an herbivore or an omnivore? And does it have any mutualistic or antagonistic relationships with other species? Those sorts of things come into play as well. So it's kind of a multi-factor combination of the abiotic environment and the biotic interactions that are going to dictate why a species is where it is. Oops. Okay. Another pattern that we should probably mention is this thing called spatial autocorrelation. And if you've ever taken a geography course, you've probably been exposed to this idea. It's not, this is a geography concept. It's not necessarily specific to biogeography. And so if we were going to apply it to biogeography, though, we could say that environmental conditions tend to become more dissimilar as distance between those two sites increases. So as you get further away from like if you pick a point, and if you get further away from that point, the environment tends to become less like your original point. And that's kind of the backwards way of saying it. I mean, the real way is sort of spaces or points that are close to each other are more likely to be similar to each other. And so, if you pick a point, in this neighborhood, if if you move like, a couple feet or a couple meters, you're still in that neighborhood, or whatever this, I'm actually not sure what this image back here is, but looks like neighborhoods. And, so if you don't move very far, the environment doesn't change that much. But if you start moving larger distances, then the environment starts to change more. That's sort of the idea of spatial autocorrelation. And it's not specific to biogeography, but it does apply to biogeography. So the physical conditions tend to be similar when you're closer to, your point of interest. And that has biogeographic like implications as well. So your biomes, the species that are located, the biodiversity that's there tends to be more similar to points that are closer to each other than points that are further away. So that's just always something to kind of be aware of. Another pattern is the gradient pattern. And this is a really common one. There's all sorts of gradients. And so what we're talking about here is that environmental conditions tend to exhibit specific patterns along major geographic gradients. And if you're not necessarily sure what a geographic gradient is, it could be temperature, it could be precipitation, it could be latitude, elevation, depth, salinity. These are sort of physical, these are sort of geographical, and these ones would be aquatic. But there's and some of them interplay. Like as you move away from the equator in latitude, you tend to get a decrease in temperature. Same thing as when you move up in elevation, you tend to get a decrease in temperature. As you increase depth in water, you get a decrease in temperature. And so there's all sorts of different types of gradients. Some of them are related, some of them are not. But if we're saying the types of species that are there is going to be dependent on these physical conditions, if the physical conditions are changing along some gradient, then you can expect the species composition, like what species are there and what densities and things, you would expect those to be changing as well. And so ultimately, if we were sort of put all this together, we can sort of come to this conclusion and say biome types, and a biome is just sort of this large geographic grouping that takes into account the physical condition, the physical plant or the plant life, and the types of species that are found there, sort of a combination of all these things. Biome types are shaped by the physical environment and the environmental conditions and patterns. And some of them are along major geographic gradients. You can kind of look at this and see some latitudinal patterns. So, the equator is going to be somewhere in here. As we move away from the equator, you can see sort of moving from tropical to warm tropical, and then to some drier environments, and then cold and ice environments. Sorry, I said warm tropical, but warm temperate environment. So you can sort of see that transition in both hemispheres as a little bit as you move away from the equator. That's one of the largest or the most common patterns in biogeography, is this latitudinal pattern of decreasing temperature and shifts in corresponding vegetation and overall biome types in correspondence to that. So ultimately what we're saying here is sort of this geographic template is like sort of layering all these things on top of each other. So you have the responses to the physical conditions, which organisms have lots of different responses. They could evolve adaptations, they can move around, they can have large scale evolution, like become different species altogether, or become unsuccessful and go extinct in some cases too. So that all happens, and then you have these interactions on top of that. How are species interacting with each other? And something I didn't really mention, but you can have the influence of ecosystem engineers, and the most obvious one there is us. We're dominating the landscape, and so we're shifting the trajectory of all sorts of species. So oftentimes we're forcing them to go extinct. But there's also more interesting stuff going on where we're altering stuff and don't even really know how we're altering it yet. So there's that, but we're not the only ones. Beavers are usually a common example of that. Obviously not doing anything on the scale that we do, but still pretty noticeably can modify their environment. There's other ones too, like prairie dogs, I guess maybe would be an example of that. And then so layering all these types of things on top of each other, and then you have this temporal dynamic where the landscape is not static; it actually changes over time. The plate tectonics, continents are moving around. There's earthquakes, there's volcanoes, there's floods, and all sorts of things that can drastically alter the physical environment. And so that on top of that is going to do that. So if you combine sort of all of these things, you're sort of getting at what the fundamental geographic template kind of is. Um, so let's kind of talk about some of these specific things that we just mentioned. I think last week it sort of introduced this idea, and it's probably not a new idea for anyone, but latitude, this idea that temperature varies with latitude, and a lot of that has to do with, um, the fact that Earth is circular and the angle of the incoming solar radiation, whereas if you're near the equator, it's pretty direct, and so you're getting a lot of solar energy per area. But if you start to move away from that, then the angle is different. And so basically you're lengthening, a couple things are happening here. You're spreading out the same amount of incoming radiation over a larger area. So the specific area, like single point here, is just getting less overall radiation than a point is down here. Another thing is the column of the atmosphere is longer up here than it is here. So there's more probably reflection and absorption going on in the atmosphere up here than down here. So a couple things that contribute to the pattern that latitudes further from the equator receive less solar radiation. Another sort of thing related to solar radiation is the angle of the Earth. And you probably are aware that the Earth is tilted on its axis, 23.5 degrees. And that has implication, that's basically creating the seasons in the northern and southern hemispheres, depending on which hemisphere is facing toward the sun. But also, if you're on an equinox, then that's still a seasonal sort of thing going on there. But that's when everywhere is getting a more equal portions, just because of the tilt of the Earth is different during the equinoxes than. Or sort of its orientation towards the sun there. But that's sort of things on a temporal dynamic. And that is important. We see all sorts of seasonal temporal changes. There's a whole field of study called phenology that we might talk about more at some point. It's kind of related to biogeography, but it's instead of being spatial, it's more temporal and like looking at the timing of when certain things, when do trees leaf out on certain continents or at certain latitudes, and when do they flower, and when do things reproduce, and things like that. So it's more about timing than spatial aspects of biogeography. We mentioned wind a little bit, and on a global scale, this turns out to be pretty important. And there's different types of winds. It's not super important that I'm not gonna make you memorize these types of winds or anything, but there's some important things like these cells are actually composed of these wind patterns, like things you've probably heard of, like the westerlies and the northeast trade winds create these. I think it's a little bit easier to visualize here, these types of wind patterns. And so one thing that's kind of interesting, I mean, you probably have heard this at some point, but when Europeans, during sort of the age of exploration for Europe anyway, when they started expanding and exploring things, and coming to North America, a lot of that was made possible by these trade winds, where people would sail. They'd head south, and then they'd eventually be able to head west over on the trade winds, and then they'd come up through South and Central Americas, and eventually to North America, and then head back on the westerlies. And so that has a impact for us personally as humans and how we move across the globe historically, but also has some impacts for, actually probably even more impacts for life around the planet, because you're circulating, these are generally warmer currents, and then at higher latitudes or lower, away from the equator, you're getting these cold currents that can move, and you get these mixing and sort of sinking. Appeared sort of the famous I forget what it's called, like the conveyor belt sort of energy sort of thing, where you get like warm water coming and then sinking off of Greenland down here, and it sort of redistributes energy and cools and warms the ocean in certain directions. And climate change is actually throwing a big wrench into this because it's melting glaciers up here and changing the temperatures of the water and raising sea level rise. So there's all sorts of things that all sorts of implications that these sorts of currents have, and that a lot of that is sort of this interplay between the wind patterns and the ocean current and temperatures. So that definitely has some impact on biogeographic patterns. One other thing I want to talk about kind of quickly here for this portion of the video is elevation. So if we talked about latitude, if you increase in latitude away from the equator, then you sort of decrease in temperature. The same sort of thing happens in elevation, whereas if you increase in elevation, you get a decrease in temperature. And there's this common thing. So mountains tend to have, mountain summits tend to have really similar environments almost wherever they're at on the planet, even if they're at lower altitudes, or sorry, latitudes, even if they're near the equator, they tend to have lower temperature in similar types of environments, sort of tundra-like environments where it's cold, can sometimes not be a lot of moisture all the way up here. There's snow, usually lower biodiversity, and things like that that's related with, this is common to mountains pretty much wherever you're looking. So you get this decrease in temperature, but there's also something else that happens sort of as a result of this. So as if air is getting pushed up in elevation here, that temperature is going to decrease. And what happens, without really going into the physics of this, is that as air can hold a certain amount of moisture. Warm air can hold more moisture than cold air. And so as the air cools, when it gets pushed up in elevation here, it cools off and it becomes saturated because it can't hold as much moisture. And it becomes fully saturated, clouds can form, and then you can actually get precipitation. And so that's a really common phenomenon on the windward side. Like if wind is coming from this direction, it can push the air up. Moisture can collect down here, and then as it cools, it gets released up here. And so you get a bunch of heavy precipitation occurring on one side of the mountain, and then when it gets pushed over, sort of the reverse happens, where now the air is really, really dry, and it comes down and it warms. And so it can actually warm up more on this side than on this side, and it's very dry. So you can get these really dramatic changes in the environment, because over here you're getting sort of a cool, wet environment, whereas over here you end up with a really, really warm, really, really dry environment because of this dynamic. And this is called, the cooling is adiabatic cooling. So basically a change in pressure causes a change in the temperature, and that causes this precipitation event. And then this over here is what's called a rain shadow, where you have this really dry, warm air swooping down. And usually you have desert-like conditions when you have this sort of phenomenon. So that's called a rain shadow, if you've ever heard that term before. And so yeah, we're just sort of reiterating that the adiabatic cooling causes cooler air with more precipitation on the windward side, and warmer air with less precipitation on the leeward side. So this is the windward side, this is the leeward side over here. And you can kind of see that graphical representation here, where it happens at different rates depending on how much moisture is in the air. So if you have no condensation, no evaporation, air tends to cool at basically, warms, however they're sort of depicting this. Warming at 10 degrees Celsius per kilometer. So if you're sort of moving down in elevation, you're going to warm, which is on the x-axis temperature, at about 10 degrees. That's sort of the slope of the line there, 10 degrees per kilometer. But it's a different rate because that's really uncommon. Like there's almost always moisture in the air at some point. I mean, there's not really anywhere you're going to go that would have zero moisture in the air. You have to be really dry, but so you get a different relationship depending on how much water or moisture is in the air. But the overall trend is going to be the same no matter where, what the rate is. You're still going to see a decrease in temperature as you move up, and then an increase in temperature as you move back down. And that's going to have dramatic impacts for what type of environment you might have on either side of those of the mountain range.